this version of me is being moved by this version of me, and this version is being moved by this version. But who moves me? Well, I suppose I do. At least that's to say, I move me. But who moves I? And how does he, or I, for that matter, do it? Unless it's me, of course. The thing is, I've got no strings attached, except inside. But what are these strings attached to, and who moves them? I'm told that it's my brain, but I'm not immediately aware of having one. I'm not immediately aware of it. I'm only aware of the results. And I can do all that I have to do, like moving him, for instance, without having to think about whatever I'm thinking with, if you get what I or he means. If we try to perform an awkward physical movement, say carrying a brimming glass from one table to another, everyone knows quite intuitively the sort of precautions that are needed. We have to look to see how full the glass is. We have to watch the surface of the water, try the weight, and above all, move very, very slowly. The relationship between picking up the glass and what we need to do in order to bring that about is so self-evident that there seems to be no room for anything else to happen in between. We know, as a matter of fact, that every time the various muscles which are involved begin to contract, that there's an elaborate play of nervous activity in our brain. And this nervous activity may even extend to muscles which play no immediate part in the action. I wonder if this girl even knows that she is making those inadvertent movements of her lips and tongue. The point is, we are quite unaware of all these events, and even when we are reminded of them, they seem quite irrelevant to the performance of the act itself. Somehow, it seems as if the thought of the act, the mere wish to bring it about, is enough. There seem to be no intermediate stages. Of course, when I wanted to switch off that gramophone, I knew that there were certain intermediate stages I had to go through, and I knew quite clearly what they were. I had to press the switch, and in order to press the switch, I had to reach out my arm. But there were no intermediate stages in reaching out my arm. There wasn't something I had to do first. Something may have happened first, nerve impulses and muscle contractions, so I'm told, but I didn't have to make them happen. They were what happened when I moved my arm. But as far as I was concerned, what made my arm move was me making it. I was simply not conscious of the intermediate processes involved. Now, I think that's one of the reasons why scientific neurology took so long to emerge. In fact, until comparatively recently, the ability of the unaided or unmediated will to bring about physical events seemed so self-explanatory that far from wishing to explain it, the will, in terms of physical processes, human beings quite naturally chose to explain physical processes in terms of the will. Aristotle, for instance, thought that stones fell not because of the action of a physical force, but because they were moved by some sort of psychological urge or wish to return to their natural resting place in the universe. Stones fell because they wished to, and therefore, presumably, limbs rose and fell because their owners wished them to. As far as he was concerned, mind was the sovereign authority in the universe. It made the growing child. It moved the stars, and it moved the universe. And since will was the executive arm of this spiritual authority, it had the power of causing action without the intervening assistance of anything other than the limbs which it moved. And yet, of course, there were objections to this. Even Aristotle had to recognize that parts of the body could still move of their own accord, often quite embarrassingly. He could hardly fail to see that these movements were essentially automatic and unconscious. But he was so strongly committed to the idea that thought was all-powerful that he had to argue that each of these simple, lowly reflex actions were moved by souls or spirits of a lower order, and that each one was responsible for its own private reflex, as if the conscious activity of the mind was performed by the monarch, and that all these minor functions were executed by silent courtiers. But as time went on, it gradually became apparent that this wasn't an altogether satisfactory arrangement. After all, wishes, wants, and urges are mental events. They take place in the mind, wherever that is, whereas kicks, twitches, and gestures take place somewhere else, in the physical world. So what was needed was some sort of bridging process between the mind on the one hand and the body on the other. Something, in other words, which could turn the ghostly actions of the mind into the physical movement of the limbs. There had to be some sort of intermediate substance, something which was halfway between mind and matter, as weightless and transparent as thought, but at the same time with enough substance to move a heavy limb. This mysterious substance has a very ancient pedigree. At one time or another, it's been identified with heat, with light, with radiance, even breath or pneuma, hence the old name for psychology, which was referred to as pneumatology until the middle of the 19th century. But Galen's animal spirits, as he called them, were probably the first attempt to put nervous action into a coherent physiological system. His idea was not unlike a distillery, where coarse, undigested matter enters at one end and a clear, almost vaporous fluid emerges at the other. This idea of Galen's conveniently linked together all the known physiological notions of the time, from nutrition right through to respiration. It brought together liver, lungs, heart, and brain. There were 3 stages in this distillation process. First, blood was brewed in the liver from food. This introduced so-called natural spirits. These were refined into vital spirits in the heart. The final stage of refinement took place in the ventricles of the brain, yielding a weightless, fiery principle called animal spirits, which could now do the invisible job of moving the muscles. Now, according to Galen, the brain and its nerves was an arrangement of hollow cisterns and tubes which was filled throughout by a thin, imponderable fluid which he called animal spirits. Now, as we've already seen, he had an elaborate scheme for converting food into animal spirits. You see, by tracing the origin of animal spirits back to something as gross and as physical as food, he thought that he'd given it, or granted it, the ability to move something as physical as a muscle. But on the other hand, by insisting that it underwent successive refinements as it went through the heart and the brain, he also thought that he had thinned it down to the point where it also seemed indistinguishable from mind. Well, of course, this hypothesis simply won't work. The difference between mind on the one hand and matter on the other is not one that can be overcome by a straightforward industrial process. Well, in spite of the fact that there are such obvious and insuperable logical problems associated with an arrangement of this sort, one can also see why it was so attractive. At the time when Galen was working, Roman civil engineers had succeeded in making very sophisticated waterworks, which could transmit fluid through spouts and pipes and tubes to supply homes and move fountains. In the Renaissance, interest in fountains was revived, not simply for the ornamental pleasure which they gave, but because the fountain, as such, was often regarded as a metaphor of the endless replenishment and recycling of the world's spirit. when the Renaissance anatomist Vesalius came to describe the action of the human brain, he accepted the hydrostatic principles of Galen. In fact, the magical power of the fountain image retained its hold on the scientific imagination for at least another 100 years. And it was probably as a result of seeing ornamental waterworks, much like these, that the French philosopher Descartes arrived at his famous model of human action.
You may have seen in the grottos and fountains which are in our royal gardens that the simple force with which the water moves in issuing from its source is sufficient to put into motion various machines, and even to set various instruments playing, or to make them pronounce words according to the varied disposition of the tubes which convey the water. And indeed, one may very well compare the nerves of the animal which I am describing with the tubes of the machines of these fountains, the muscles and tendons of the animal with the other various engines and springs which serve to move these machines. Also, the animal's spirits, the source of which is the heart, and to which the ventricles of the brain are the reservoirs, with the water which puts them in motion.
So, according to Descartes, the interaction between mind and matter took place in the pineal gland of the brain. This was the seat of the immaterial soul. And when the soul willed an action, it opened little pores in the reservoir of animal spirits. These pores opened into the hollow nerves, which then channeled the animal spirits into the appropriate muscle. According to Descartes, the head of pressure drove the animal spirits into the muscles and blew them up like balloons, which then moved the limb. Now, although this picturesque hydraulic system sounds plausible, it actually has all the philosophical faults of the original scheme, plus a new one all of its own. On the one hand, it still relies on the nonsensical or logically absurd notion of an imponderable substance halfway between mind and matter, as to say, something with no physical properties at all, which doesn't mean anything. But on the other hand, it also suggests something which simply isn't true, namely that muscles inflate or blow up when they're stimulated. Now, the fact that they didn't soon became apparent when the rage for physical experiment started in the 17th century. The Dutch physiologist Swammerdam removed a muscle from a frog, leaving a long leash of nerve attached to it. Now, as Swammerdam did, I've put the muscle into a sealed glass U-tube filled with saline. Now, when I stimulate the cut end of the nerve here, now I'm using electricity, whereas poor old Swammerdam had to use a forceps. And as you can see, the muscle's twitching very nicely, but there's no change in the level in the U-tube. Well, I think the conclusion's quite obvious. The muscle must be contracting without any change in its overall volume. You see, if the muscle had been blown up by animal spirits, or by anything else for that matter, it would have displaced the extra volume, causing the level in the U-tube to rise. As you can see, nothing happens at all. But in any case, what's just as interesting is the fact that the muscle goes on twitching, even though it's been disconnected from its supposed reservoir of animal spirits in the brain. So, even if it were being blown up by fluid, which as you can see it's not, where would all the extra fluid have come from? Well, if the doctrine of animal spirits is logically absurd, and if the hydraulic theory of muscular action is simply untrue, as we've seen, what is the explanation of muscular action? Well, Swammerdam quite wisely left this question open. You see, as things stood in the 17th century, no one could have put forward a really plausible alternative to the classical theory of Descartes. All the same, there were vague intimations of what would eventually prove to be a central theory of modern neurology. And that was this, namely that the power of movement, the capacity of a muscle to act, was something which was inherent in the muscle itself and in the nerve. It wasn't something which had to be supplied to the nerve or the muscle from a reservoir of animal spirits or anything else. Now, this idea was called the doctrine of irritability, and the English scientist Francis Glisson was one of the first people to express the theory clearly.
It is clear that the muscles are not inflated or swollen at the time that they are contracting, but on the contrary, are lessened, shrunk, and subsided. From this, therefore, we may infer that the fibers are shortened by an intrinsic, vital movement, and have no need of any abundant afflux of spirits, whether animal or vital, by which they are inflated, and being so shortened, carry out the movements ordered by the brain.
Now, this idea of intrinsic muscular irritability was picked up and developed by the great 18th century Swiss physician Albrecht von Haller. Now, von Haller made it quite clear that the ability of muscle to contract was the result of some property which was inherent in the very material from which it was made, and that it was not due to a tidal wave of animal spirits or anything else flowing into it through the hollow nerves. Now, he called this inherent property of the muscle the vis incita, and he demonstrated it quite clearly by showing that the muscle could be made to twitch simply by having it pricked with the point of a sharp instrument. Now, he also suggested that the nerve which was linked to the muscle also had an energy of its own, and that this, as it were, this vis nervosa, simply applied, as it were, a spark to a charge which was contained in the muscle, rather like the firing pin of a pistol, in fact. Now, of course, as it stands, this idea doesn't really help very much. Simply to say that nerves and muscles are intrinsically lively and to give their inherent properties a couple of impressive Latin names doesn't really count as an explanation. And in fact, many of von Haller's contemporaries regarded it as another way of paraphrasing what had mystified them in the first place. But it was hardly surprising. After all, when a nerve is stimulated and carries a message, it shows no visible alteration. It doesn't change color, it doesn't contract, it doesn't make a sound, and it doesn't alter its shape. So the idea of it transmitting a message would have seemed just as mysterious as the idea of it distributing animal spirits. In fact, until the end of the 18th century, it was very hard to imagine the transmission of any physical effect in other than a visibly mechanical form. For the scientists of the classical period, the universe as a whole was operated by pushes and by pulls, by visible knocks and impacts. For instance, when I flick this domino here, I can actually see the effect traveling to the other end. But even at the invisible level, the universe was regarded as an assembly of impenetrable atoms. And according to scientists like Newton, for example, the only way in which physical changes could be transmitted from here to there was by impacts traveling from one particle to the next. Now, the awkward point about this mechanical model is that it doesn't really account for the scale of the events. The impacts become fainter and fainter, whereas a nerve impulse stays the same size from one end of the action to the other. Now, what's more, the size or the energy of the muscular response is much larger than the size or energy of the stimulus which provokes it. So nervous and muscular action is much more like the behavior of an explosive, whereas you can see a small flame or spark can ignite a large release of energy. So, in other words, the scale of what happens is the result of the energy which is stored in the charge. It's not the result of the size of energy provided by the spark or the stimulus which sets it off. Now, all this seems quite obvious to us now, so why on earth didn't it occur to the scientists of the 17th century? After all, they had explosives and firearms, pistols and cannons and so forth. So why didn't they think of muscular action as an explosion? Well, I suppose in some ways the answer's quite obvious. The nerve doesn't fizzle like a fuse, and the muscle makes no sound, and it releases no light. so it would have been very hard for them to visualize it as a source or a store of energy. They had to imagine some alternative form of energy which was invisible, but which nevertheless had the same mathematical relationship between the size of the stimulus and the size of the response. Well, it was gradually realized during the 19th century that electrical energy was involved, and that what was traveling along a nerve and into a muscle was a wave of electricity, what we now call the nerve impulse. And since we now have electronic amplifiers like this, in fact they're used every day in hospitals all over the world, we can actually show the electrical explosion which accompanies the mechanical twitch. So, I'm going to treat myself like the frog muscle you saw a moment earlier. I'm going to excite one of the main nerves in my arm up here in the elbow, and using these electrodes here. Now, when I do that, the nerve impulse will travel down the arm and will cause a muscle in my thumb to twitch. Never do to a frog anything which you're unwilling to do to yourself. Now, these electrodes over the ball of my thumb here are going to pick up and show the electrical explosion as the nerve impulse arrives. And you'll see it here on this screen. Now, there's going to be a regular pulse from these electrodes so that the nerve impulse will be repeated and the explosion will be repeated. So, here we go. Quite nasty. And here, then, is the visible evidence of the invisible nervous explosion. The bump on the right is the muscular response, and the spike on the left is the nerve impulse itself. That nerve impulse is fired in the following way. Now, we can regard the nerve as a sort of accumulator which has an electrical potential locked up in its chemical components. On the outside, surrounding the nerve, there is a fluid which is rich in sodium. Inside, there's a fluid rich in potassium, and the membrane separating them is impermeable. Now, when two chemicals are separated in this way, there's an electrical potential across the membrane. A local change in the permeability of the membrane neutralizes this potential by briefly allowing the two chemicals to mix and equalize their concentration. This local disturbance excites the next piece of membrane, which changes in the same way, and so on, all down the line. The disadvantage of this arrangement is that the nerve has to continuously replenish itself. All these events are very complicated indeed, and they're easier to understand if we regard the nerve as a trail of gunpowder. As soon as the fuse is lit, a wave of combustion, a local flame, fizzles its way along the trail, consuming the energy stored in the gunpowder. However, a gunpowder trail can only be used once because the flame burns away all the stored energy. In nerves, the trail is relayed almost as fast as it's consumed. It's as if a powder monkey followed the flame, relaying a new track. There are two important consequences of this arrangement. First, the stimulus either succeeds or fails, and once it succeeds, the size and the heat of the flame depends on the amount of gunpowder in the trail. It's an all or nothing affair. The second consequence is this. Since the flame consumes its own fuel as it goes along, no other flame can pass the same way, of course, until the trail has been replenished and relayed, which means that the rate at which flames can follow one another is limited by how quickly that trail can be relayed. Now, since the flame is always the same heat and brightness, irrespective of what it was that set it off in the first place, there's naturally no way of telling how strong that original stimulus was simply by inspecting the heat or the brightness of the flame as it travels. It would be like trying to tell whether the trail had been lit with a match or a blow lamp or a hammer simply by inspecting the flame. Well, this, of course, raises a problem. If the nerve impulse is always the same size, regardless of the size of the stimulus which started it off, how is it possible to register change in intensity? How is it, in other words, that we can tell the difference between a light touch and a heavy one, or a slight movement of a muscle, or an extensive one? The English physiologist Lord Adrian was able to show a way out of this problem in the 1920s. He recorded the impulses in a sensory nerve and showed that as he increased the stimulus, the nerve responded by multiplying the number of impulses which were passing along it. Now we can see this very nicely if we put a monitor into the nerve which stimulates the thumb. As the nervous action is increased, the number of electrical spikes on the graph increases steadily. The simple act of moving thumb to finger generates a rash of nerve impulses. Adrian called this the frequency-intensity law. However, there's an upper limit to it, since the rate which impulses can follow one another is limited by the speed at which the nerve can replenish its chemical store of energy. Now, roughly speaking, these events correspond to what von Haller had in mind in the 18th century when he imagined, but wasn't able to prove, the intrinsic vitality of nerve and muscle, his vis nervosa and his vis incita. Von Haller, as it were, simply sketched in an outline of a notion and was forced, of course, to leave his successors to fill in the gaps. In fact, it took 200 years to do so. But on the other hand, his contemporaries were able to take immediate advantage of Descartes' other proposal, not the one about how muscles worked, but the one which said that there was a fixed wiring diagram in the nervous system which explained how it was that certain stimuli consistently produced the same response, that whenever the eye was touched, it blinked, or that whenever the hand was burnt, it flinched.
If, for example, fire comes near the foot, the minute particles of this fire, which, as you know, move with great velocity, have the power to set in motion the spot of skin of the foot which they touch, and by this means, pulling upon the delicate thread which is attached to the spot of skin, they open up at the same instant the pore in the brain against which the delicate thread ends. Just as by pulling at one end of a rope, one causes to strike at the same instant a bell which hangs on the other end. When this pore is opened, the animal spirits of the cavity enter into the tube and are carried by it partly to the muscles which pull back the foot from the fire, partly to those which turn the eyes and the head in order to regard it, and partly to those which serve to advance the hands and to bend the whole body in order to shield itself.
Well, that was all very well as far as automatic actions were concerned. It certainly removed the need for Aristotle's minor souls. But on the other hand, Descartes' theological scruples prevented him from regarding human beings as brute machines. He was quite happy to regard animals as robots, but he understandably refused to accept the idea that the human faculties of will, intelligence, foresight, and moral choice could be explained in the same way. He insisted that man was distinguished from the mechanical beasts by owning a rational, immaterial soul which was seated in the pineal gland. Now, there are insuperable philosophical problems caused by this dualism. It simply takes us back to square one. After all, how can phantom fingers move real muscles? All the same, he had performed a major service to future neurology, mainly by splitting off the higher functions of man from all the other ones. By locking the mental phantom in its splendid penthouse up in the head, Descartes had made it possible to examine the rest of the machine in a straightforward mechanical fashion. I suppose the most famous involuntary reaction is the knee jerk. This reflex is simply a convenient way for the doctor to sample the function of our nervous system. Early on, this was regarded as a purely local action and did not involve the central nervous system at all. However, if Descartes' model was true, the stimulus had to travel into the central nervous system and then reflect back into the leg. And this meant that even the simplest automatic reflex had to have at least two components, one sensory and the other motor. Now, we've got rather a bizarre model here to show this. We'll regard this box here as the sense organ in the skin, and I'll plug in the sensory nerve into it. And it starts to transmit impulses along its length. So we have here the sensory nerve. Now, here we have the motor nerve, which is going to take that impulse down into the muscle, and we'll regard the chair here as the muscle. Now, the scientists who took up this idea recognized, of course, that the idea of reflection was only a metaphor, and that the way in which the incoming stimulus turned the corner inside the central nervous system and went back into the motor nerve and into the muscle was not simply a mechanical ricochet. In between the two fibers, that's to say the sensory nerve entering the nervous system and the motor nerve leaving it, there had to be a third element or a junction which could switch the impulse into the appropriate outgoing channel and thus complete the so-called reflex arc. Now, when he illustrated this, Descartes put the third element or junction right up in the brain, which meant that the incoming message had to take a very long path or excursion before it finally emerged from the central nervous system through the motor nerve. Now, although it's true that stimuli sometimes do travel up the vertical axis and into the brain, and sometimes enter consciousness, which allows us to say ouch as well as flinch, we know, of course, that it's not necessary for it to make such a long excursion before it completes the arc, and that a large number of automatic reactions can take place quite independently of the brain. Everyone knows, for instance, that a chicken can twitch and even run around without its head, and these facts were already known to the physiologists of the 17th century. In the early 1820s, the British anatomist Sir Charles Bell and the French physiologist François Magendie, independently of one another, made a fundamental discovery. If we look at the spinal cord at any one of its many segments, we can see that there is a pair of nerves entering it on each side. Now, Bell and Magendie were able to prove that the fibers attached to the back side of the spinal cord only carried incoming or sensory impulses, whereas the fibers which were fixed to the front surface of the spinal cord only carried outgoing or motor impulses. Here, then, was a clear separation of function. So, any stimulus which causes a reaction must take the Bell-Magendie pathway. Which sense organ was stimulated by the impact? And how did that impulse then enter the central nervous system? In the last years of the 19th century, the English neurologist Charles Sherrington tackled all these questions head-on. He managed to abolish the knee jerk by cutting the nerve roots which were attached to the spinal cord. And it didn't matter which root he cut, either the sensory or the motor, since either one broke the continuity of the nervous circle, as Bell had called it. Well, where did the sensory impulse arise from? What was the stimulus? And what sense organ actually appreciated it? Now, in addition to the 5 traditional senses of vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, scientists have always vaguely assumed the existence of a sixth one. This was a sense capable of appreciating the state of stretch or tension in the various muscles of the body. The fact that it's possible to move our limbs with great accuracy without having to watch them proves that there must be something informing us of their position, about where they are. The existence of a muscular sense is the only way we can explain the success of this performance. Although this girl uses her eyes to estimate the weight of the glass, she could lift it just as accurately with her eyes closed. This must mean that her muscles are somehow weighing the load. And what's more, the muscles continue to do this all through the task. We can see how important these sense organs are by looking at a patient who has a small tumor at the point where the sensory fibers from the muscles in the leg enter the spinal cord. Mr. Dabrowski finds it impossible to locate his own limbs with his eyes closed. I want you to close your eyes first. Okay. Now, first of all, I'm going to lift your leg. I want you to point to where you think the toe is.
Right there. Right there.
And where is it now?
A little lower. Right there.
Now where?
Right there.
The only way he can complete the sensory loop between limb and brain is through his eyes. All right, Mr. Dabrowski, now we'll see how good you are with the eyes open. See how it is. Now, follow it around.
Can you see in the camera?
One of the great gun aimers of all time, you see. All right, now close your eyes. But where are the organs of our sixth sense? Well, in 1894, Sherrington found them linked to the spinal cord by fibers which entered through the incoming or sensory route. They're called muscle spindles. We now know that muscle spindles act rather like spring balancers, recording the state of stretch of the muscles in which they're embedded. Using the knee jerk, Sherrington was able to show that the blow exerted a sudden stretch on the great extensor muscle on the front of the thigh. This caused a lengthening of the muscle spindles, which are arranged parallel to the muscle fibers. A volley of sensory impulses is fired into the spinal cord, where they're reflected back into the motor channel. He was interested to find that only one spinal segment was involved in this particular process. The reflex looped back into the muscle from which the sensory stimulus had come. The thigh muscle now shortened, thereby taking the strain off the spindles. This is the simplest reflex we can observe, and Sherrington called it a short spinal reflex. Well, so much for the source of the reflex, then. That's where it comes from. Well, how's it actually executed? How does the incoming stimulus actually find its way to the appropriate muscle? Well, when Sherrington tried to answer this question, he immediately found himself in the midst of a swarm of problems. And we can see what some of these were if we compare the nervous system with a man-made instrument which is meant to have a repertoire of predictable replies. In the piano, each key is mechanically attached to its own lever, so that when the key is pressed down, the hammer always strikes the same wire and therefore sounds the same note. You see, in the piano, there's a fixed one-to-one correspondence between each key and the note which it sounds. Whereas in the spinal cord, Sherrington found that the relationship between the input and the output was much more elaborate. You see, in the skin, for instance, a small local stimulus can easily excite not one muscle, but several muscles at the same time. In fact, the influence of a local stimulus may spread so far inside the spinal cord that the limb on the other side may move across the midline to remove the stimulus. This orchestrated action is created by one small stimulus. It's as if by striking one key on the piano, one had called forth not one note, but a whole chord. Or even a series of chords played one after another, making up not simply a harmony, but a melody as well. Well, this principle applies to simple reflexes as well. Even in the knee jerk, where it looks as if only one muscle is involved. Sherrington showed that this apparently simple response involves a considerable amount of interaction. Well, the point is this. All our muscles are arranged in pairs so that they oppose one another mechanically. In the elbow, I've got a muscle on the front of my arm, that's the biceps, which bends the joint, and another one on the back, that's the triceps, which straightens it. Now, even when my arm is at rest, these two muscles are straining slightly against one another to keep my arm steady. Which means that if I want to actually move the joint one way or the other, let's say if I want to contract the biceps so as to bend the joint, the muscle which is trying to straighten it on the back, the triceps, must now relax its effort for a moment. And what's so remarkable is that this elaborate transaction can all be performed by the spinal cord on its own. Now, perhaps this helps to explain the question which I put right at the start of the program. Why is it? Why is it that we are so unaware of what we have to do whenever we want to move our limbs? The point is that because the spinal cord can automatically, on its own, compose harmonious chords of muscular action, it's possible to perform movements without having to think them out muscle by muscle. And that's what makes this performance possible. The reason why Dudley Moore is so at ease on this keyboard is that he has no need to rehearse the keyboard he has inside his own spinal cord. He can give all his attention to playing the piece for the simple reason that the spinal cord has already assumed so much of the responsibility for playing his hands. Certain musical passages won't work artistically unless they're played at the right speed. And this speed may be so fast that there simply isn't time to think about the movements one by one. By practicing them over and over again, they become automatic, so that the whole package is fired off in one go. They have to become second nature. But if anything in a rehearsed or memorized piece is changed, then problems can begin. for instance, if you play a piece from memory, a classical piece like a Mozart minuet, now that presumably has been engraved in your memory. There are certain muscular movements which are fixed.
Yes.
Well, now, if you could play a little piece of that.
Well.
Now, if I ask you to play it continually now, and to, without looking, to transpose it into a different key. How about yeah. Now the thing is that presumably there's a totally new composition of hand movements,
yes,
which is there, which you weren't familiar with because I hadn't warned you beforehand that you were going to do it. What was happening as that transposition occurred? Were you having to revisualize the keyboard when it happened, or revisualize your hand movements, or did you simply reconceive the harmony as such?
I don't know. I don't know. I took the money. Kill me or something. I don't know what happened, except that I'm thinking of the sound of it and the notes. Let me do it in another. So I've got to think again. I'm thinking of the positions of the sound of the notes, the position of the inversions of the chords, and now I don't know what I'm thinking of actually.
When you're playing something like Bach, which you're familiar with, does this instantly sprout sounds in your head, which then dictates what your hand must do, or is that actually going straight to hand movements?
Wow. I don't quite know what the process is, thank goodness. But I find that I'm doing things unconsciously, you know, in a passage like this, where the hands are quite independent. You've got the left hand going, and the left and the right hand going. They're very independent and very, very much their own people. And if you put them together, in a way you're dividing your mind, and yet I'm not quite sure if you can actually do that. I think you can think in two parts at once, more or less, maybe three, but I think you actually flick from one to the other. If I'm reading music, I don't look at the keyboard at all, unless I've got a big leap. Like if I was reading for the first time, I go. But I'm looking before the leap. That's funny. I would probably just look down briefly for that, you know, well, that's not that hard. You can sort of feel your way to that one.
But when you say, but this business of feeling your way, what is it that tells you when you're feeling that you're on your way?
Well, because I know that I mean, I don't have to sort of think much about it. I know it's there. It's really rather when you're like playing the organ pedals. You know you're playing with your feet and you nudge. You know more or less where a note will be, and you find out exactly by playing on what would be the black notes here, by just feeling out with your toe. I'm doing the same thing here. I know that this chord is up here, and my hand is right there because my little finger is hitting the black note right next to the top note. So I'm sort of doing it by a process of like Braille, I suppose. But
unlike Braille, they're absolutely regular, all these notes. There's 3 and 2 and 3 and 2. How do you know that you're on this lot of 3 rather than on that lot of 3? Have you memorized the actual muscular feeling of the distance between those two lots of 3?
I don't know about the muscular feeling. The distance is very easy to feel out, though. I mean, to have in my mind as a constant ruler. I mean, the difference between playing that and playing that, or playing that, or even... No, I can't feel that because I'm not up there that often, you see. Pardon the expression.
And you can get, as it were, a rough adjustment, but can you, within the rough adjustment, once you're up there, also without looking, get the difference between the 2 adjacent black notes, or between one white note and the next black, as well, without looking?
Yes, because, I mean, the feeling under my hand is very... It's very sort of natural, you know. I mean, I tell where I am, you know. Thank you very much. But it's the position is.
But that's a muscular memory.
It must be a muscular memory. I don't think about that at all.
There are no muscles represented in the brain, only movements. And that what you call into action are movements which happen to use muscles, but you don't have to play on a phantom keyboard inside your head in order to bring out the right muscular movements to play the right notes.
Right.
All that you have to set in motion are the movements that you want. But it may well be, from what you're saying, that it's an even higher level than that you don't even have movements represented, but only moods. Moods then unconsciously dictate movements, which then call into action muscles, which then evoke notes on the piano.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be anything but emotion and a sort of an overseeing eye that's saying, well, wait a minute, you know, you're playing this piece and you need to adjust here and adjust there, so you get an overseeing sort of constructive eye and an eye that is seeing to the details.
But that's all up there.
All up there, yes. Ain't down here now. These are nothing, mate, without this. It's all gold up here. Fillings.
I think that's it.